dimensional ontologies, and non-human intelligence. Current human understanding of biology and physics is constrained by 3 spatial dimensions and 1 temporal dimension, with matter defined through standard model interactions. This explores the hypothesis that non-human intelligence may originate from higher dimensional or parallel frameworks whose physical laws, matter composition, and biological organization differ fundamentally from terrestrial life. Such entities may not be directly perceivable through conventional sensory or instrumental means, instead manifesting as partial projections or interaction cross-sections within human perceivable spacetime. It further distinguishes between dimensional entities and extraterrestrial biological life, or aliens, proposing that while both may be non-human, their ontological origins, interaction mechanisms, and constraints differ significantly. A multidisciplinary framework integrating physics, biology, neuroscience, and information theory is proposed for analysis. Human biology and physics are often implicitly treated as universal baselines for life and reality. However, this assumption may be anthropocentric. Advances in theoretical physics, particularly in higher dimensional models, quantum field theory, and cosmology, suggest that reality may encompass structures inaccessible to direct observation. Similarly, biology demonstrates that life adapts to its environment's physical constraints, rather than adhering to a single universal template. This examines the possibility that other forms of life may not be composed of matter as humans define it, that certain dimensions or parallel universes may be accessible only through indirect interaction, and that consciousness may act as a limited but non-trivial interface between dimensional frameworks. The constraints of human biology and perception would be 1. Sensory and neural limitations. The human perception is constrained to narrow electromagnetic, acoustic, and chemical ranges. Neural processing further filters reality into survival-relevant representations, rather than objective totality. Consequently, entire classes of phenomena may exist outside direct sensory access. And 2, instrumental extension and its limits. So scientific instruments extend perception, but they still remain grounded in human-defined matter interactions. So electromagnetic, strong, weak, nuclear, and gravitational. If a phenomenon does not couple to these forces, or it couples weakly, it may remain undetectable. So what is matter beyond the standard model? Well, to redefine matter, in higher dimensions or parallel frameworks, matter may not possess rest mass as defined in 3D spacetime. It may operate via alternative force carrier mechanisms, and it may exist as structured fields, topological information states, or non-local configurations. Such forms would not manifest as stable, persistent objects in human spacetime. A useful analogy in dimensional slicing. A higher dimensional entity intersecting 3D space would appear as a lower dimensional projection, and this may produce transient, disoriented, or incomplete manifestations. This would refer to dimensional cross-sections. Dimensional entities are hypothesized to originate from higher dimensional spatial fields, parallel universes with non-overlapping physical constraints, or non-spacetime informational substrates. The characteristics are reported manifestations, shadows, lights, geometric distortions, shape-shifting forms, and glitch-like behavior. These are consistent with partial projection into 3D spacetime. They're consistent with instability of cross-dimensional coupling, and it's consistent with observer-dependent perceptual reconstruction. Such entities would have a biological non-equivalence, so they would not be biological in the terrestrial sense. Their organization may resemble self-organizing fields, information-dense energetic structures, or conscious systems without cellular substrates. Emerging neuroscience and physics debates suggest consciousness may not be entirely reducible to neural activity. If consciousness possesses non-local or field-like properties, it may weakly interact with non-standard dimensions. This brings me to a perceptual access hypothesis, and this would propose that certain altered or heightened cognitive states reduce perceptual filtering, that consciousness may detect indirect signatures of higher dimensional interaction, and that perception does not equate to physical presence, but informational coupling. This does not imply belief-dependent reality, but observer-dependent detection thresholds. There is a distinction between dimensional entities and extraterrestrial life. Extraterrestrial life, referring to aliens, are defined here as biological entities arising within our spacetime. They are subject to physical laws similar to Earth's, and they are originating from other planets or extreme terrestrial environments, such as our oceans and our subsurface. Alien biology may use non-DNA informational systems, operate at different temperature, pressure, or radiation regimes, and possess neural architectures supporting enhanced cognition. However, they still remain matter-based within 3D space-time. Some extraterrestrial species may possess higher cognitive bandwidth, expanded sensory modulities, and neurological architectures capable of detecting dimensional fields. Rather than traversing dimensions, such beings might exploit spacetime curvature. They might utilize higher dimensional spatial fields for propulsion, and they might navigate through topological shortcuts or brain intersections. This reframes interdimensional travel as field-based spatial navigation. When it comes to explaining observational reports, one would be the ghosts, shadows, and lights, and these phenomena may result from energy leakage across dimensional boundaries, partial field coupling, or human perceptual reconstruction of non-classical inputs. Shape instability and projection effects. Constantly changing forms align with observer relative dimensional slicing. It aligns with incompatibility between dimensional physics, and it aligns with incomplete information transfers. Implications for scientific methodology would be 1. Limitations of reductionism. Purely materialist frameworks may be insufficient to describe non-standard ontologies. And 2. Required interdisciplinary expansion. Future study would require integration of theoretical physics, higher dimensions and quantum gravity, neuroscience and consciousness studies, information theory, and non-classical measurement paradigms. This analysis proposes that non-human intelligence may arise from fundamentally different dimensional and material frameworks than human biology. Dimensional entities, if they exist, may only interact with human reality through partial projections and conscious-mediated interfaces. Extraterrestrial biological life, while non-human, likely remains bound to our spacetime, but may possess enhanced cognitive and dimensional sensitivity. Distinguishing between these categories is essential for advancing scientific clarity and avoiding ontological conflation. While speculative, this framework remains grounded in known limitations of perception, physics, and biology, and provides testable directions for future interdisciplinary research. This presents a structured theoretical framework for evaluating the possibility of non-human intelligence that do not conform to terrestrial biology or standard three-dimensional physics. It proposes that certain reported anomalies or phenomenon, such as shadow entities, luminous forms, shape instability, and perceptual distortions, may be consistent with interactions between human observers and entities originating from higher dimensional or parallel frameworks. This further distinguishes these dimensional entities from extraterrestrial biology life, aliens, which are hypothesized to exist within our spacetime, but may possess advanced cognitive and dimensional field sensitivity. This emphasizes limitation of human perception, the constraints of current instrumentation, and the need for expanded scientific methodologies. The purpose of this is to establish a clear ontological distinction between dimensional entities and extraterrestrial biological life, to provide a physics and biologically consistent rationale for non-classical manifestations, to propose consciousness as a potential interface variable without evoking belief-based assumptions, and to identify gaps in current scientific detection models. This was written for researchers, theorists, and institutions exploring frontier questions in physics, astrobiology, and consciousness studies. Human-centric limitations in science would be 1. The biological constraints. Human sensory systems evolved for survival within a narrow environmental band. Vision, hearing, and somatosensation sample only limited physical ranges. Neural processing compresses and filters incoming data, producing an internal model rather than an objective rendering of reality. And 2. Instrumental bias. As we've discussed, scientific instruments extend perception, but they still remain dependent on known force interactions such as electromagnetic, nuclear, and gravitational. So phenomena that do not strongly couple to these forces may remain undetectable despite being physically real. Because in higher dimensions or parallel systems, matter may lack stable rest mass in 3D time-space, exist as structured fields or informational states, or operate through forces not represented in a standard model, such configurations would not appear as persistent objects when intersecting human space-time. So when a higher dimensional entity intersects 3D space, only a lower dimensional cross-section may be observable. The interaction would be partial, it would be temporarily unstable, and dependent on relevant dimensional alignments. The origin hypothesis would be that dimensional entities may arise from higher spatial dimensions, parallel universes with non-identical constants, and non-space-time informational substrates. Reported characteristics would include the shadows, lights, geometric distortions, and shape-shifting. They're all consistent with incomplete projections rather than full physical presences. These entities would not be biological in cellular sense. Future research should integrate higher dimensional physics, consciousness, and cognitive science, as well as information theoretic detection models. Failure to distinguish between dimensional entities and extraterrestrial life may lead to misinterpretation of data and flawed policy decisions. This argues that non-human intelligence, if they exist, may arise from fundamentally different physical and biological frameworks than humanity. Dimensional entities would interact with our reality only indirectly, while extraterrestrial life would remain space-time bound but potentially cognitively advanced. Recognizing these distinctions is essential for scientific rigor and future discovery. Failure to extinguish an EBL from a DNE may result in treating perceptual anomalies as physical threats, ignoring biological evidence due to overclassification, and policy decisions driven by narrative rather than data. This represents a systemic analytical failure mode. Separate analytical pipelines for EBL and DNE, independent verification standards, multidisciplinary review panels, explicit confidence level tagging of reports, and controlled language for public communication would be recommended institutional safeguards. Higher dimensional physics, theoretical, neuroscience and perception filtering, sensor fusion and anomaly rejection, and information theoretical detection limits would be research and intelligence integration recommendations. This briefing was not to assert the existence of non-human intelligence. It asserts that failure to classify Uncertainty, correctly, is itself a national and institutional risk. Maintaining clear analytical boundaries between extraterrestrial biology and hypothetical dimensional phenomenon is essential for credible science, effective defense, and public trust. This document is suitable for internal briefing, strategic review, and interdisciplinary advisory contexts. It was not intended for public release without contextual framing. The strategic purpose of its design was for government agencies, defense and intelligence organizations, scientific advisory bodies, and policy and risk assessment teams. The objectives were prevent ontological misclassification of anomalous phenomenon, to establish neutral terminology and analytical boundaries, and to support evidence-based decision-making under uncertainty. The foundational assumptions are human perception and instrumentation are incomplete. Not all anomalous reports share a common origin. Biological life and non-biological intelligence require separate models, and consciousness may act as a detection variable, not a causal force. The classification framework would be an EBL defined as spacetime native, matter-based organisms originating off Earth. The key properties are subject to known physical laws, biologically instantiated, non-human, and potential technological capability. The strategic relevance, aerospace defense, astrobiology, and interstellar propulsion and surveillance. DNEs, which is dimensional or non-spacetime entities, hypothesized intelligence originating outside standard 3D spacetime constraints. Key properties would be non-biological organization, partial or transient manifestation, weak or inconsistent coupling to known forces. Strategic relevance would be perceptual anomalies, sensor false positives, and cognitive and informational security.